It's a wild and wonderful Wednesday here on Locked On Grizzlies, and Damichael Cole is back with me to discuss all things Memphis. He decided to get Grizzlies fans fired up for once on Tuesday with an article about a possible trade target to the Grizzlies this coming offseason, or maybe even free agency, perhaps. I'm going to lead a conversation in my teacher way of how we should grade these Grizzlies proceeding throughout the rest of the season, and we're going to preview Grizzlies Warriors tonight. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Lock in with us.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to our Wednesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. It is I, Joe Mullinax, one of your hosts for this episode. And of course, it is always wonderful to be able to say one of your hosts, because that means Damichael Cole, the commercial appeal in Memphis, Tennessee, is joining me for this show. The sun shines a little bit brighter. The sound sounds a little bit good going, or a little bit better, going into your eardrums, through your cerebellum up into your limbic system. However you take in the show, whether you're using your eyes on YouTube or listening on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts, Damichael Cole and I are back together for this Wednesday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Free and available wherever you get podcasts, as I mentioned a moment ago, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, literally anywhere you get your podcast. Check us out. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, especially on YouTube as we continue to build that channel. But literally anywhere is all good. However you take in the show, on your way to work, while you're doing a workout on the treadmill or at the gym, maybe you're checking us out on a break during work days. Whatever the case might be, Damichael and I appreciate you joining us wherever it is you are doing so. And Damichael, we're going to jump right in, okay? Because I think you've got some explaining to do on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Because you like to give me a hard time every once in a while, and it's all in good fun. I want to stress that. But you give me a hard time every once in a while about my trade concepts, my longing for other players and prospects around the National Basketball Association. And yet, Damichael Cole, as I always do, because I still subscribe to the commercial appeal almost solely because of your work, I check out what Damichael's got going today. And wouldn't you know it, there's Damichael pulling a Joe Mullinax, stirring the pot about a potential target for the Grizzlies. Now, in fairness to you, he has been the target of others as well, which I'm sure helped kind of inspire the article. Plus, there are some pretty obvious connections that make Nic Claxton, who was in Memphis on Monday night for a game against the Grizzlies, as he approaches free agency, an intriguing option. We keep talking about Mikal Bridges potentially being a target for Memphis in the past. Maybe Claxton's the future of the center position for the Grizzlies.
Yeah, you know, Joe, when I talked to him in the locker room afterwards, I thought about you. I was like, this is something that Joe's
totally
gonna talk about.
It is vintage Joe Mullinax is what you did. Vintage Joe Mullinax.
So but getting to the point of why I even talked to him, I know some people, you know, there was conversation that you mentioned it like on social media, people having a conversation about, you know, the fit with Claxton and whatnot. But that wasn't really why I wrote it. I was kind of planning this for a while. Like when Nic Claxton comes to Memphis, from the standpoint of he is one of the players that not only has a relationship with Ja Morant in the NBA, he has a long-standing relationship with Ja Morant. And not only that, it's like that's important because if you know Ja Morant doesn't work out with a lot of these guys that aren't on the Grizzlies. He doesn't text a lot of these guys that aren't on the Grizzlies. Like he's not your, you know, you look in the summer, you see Kevin Durant, you know, running with anybody in the NBA pretty much. Ja isn't that type of guy. At least he hasn't been at this point of his career. So Nic Claxton is one of the few guys who has that, you know, relationship with Ja Morant where he'll see him or he'll text him every now and then. And if you've been paying attention to the shoes, because I know a lot of people are saying, oh, Nic Claxton wore the Ja ones against the Grizzlies. What does that mean? I mean, not to be the Debbie Downer, but it doesn't really mean anything in terms of the
It
future
means
of
it's
Nic
a good
Claxton.
shoe.
It just means it's a good shoe, and he's supporting a long-term friend. For those that don't know, and those that may not have checked out the article yet, Nic Claxton and Ja Morant go back to after their junior years of high school. They played on the same AAU team in South Carolina. Nic Claxton is from Greenville, and we know Ja Morant from Sumter out there in South Carolina as well. So their relationship goes back to that point. And then, of course, at that time, Ja Morant still, as a lot of people have kind of described him, was a late bloomer, wasn't really the athlete he's come to be. And that's what me and Nic Claxton talked about the most, just how proud he is of Ja Morant and the rise that he's made to this point. But I know what everybody wanted to hear was, the question I ended up asking was like, well, do you think like you'll want to play with him again? And he said, he took a deep breath and then he was like, we'll see.
Which
And
for
I think
tampering rules and regulations is probably the only thing
that's
able
about
to
the best
say.
answer you can get out of him if you don't want any
Right.
of his money to be taken out of his pocket. He could have easily, now he could have said, no, I like playing in Brooklyn, so unless he comes to Brooklyn or anything like that. But put it like this: what I gathered from it is he likes, he loved playing with Ja Morant in high school, and there's a part of him, in my opinion, that feels like I didn't get to see this version of Ja. Like, it'll be good to be paired with this version of Ja. But of course, the we'll see part of it, I think you can read in between the lines there and says there's some money things that have to work out, of course, and all that. And that's kind of where the problem comes in when you talk about Nic Claxton and Memphis, because the reason we're having this conversation, Joe, is because of the relationship. If there was no relationship between these guys, this is probably a conversation we're not having, because financially it doesn't make much sense for Memphis, like just from a projection standpoint. And then I'll let you kind of go in on that there, but just in the simplest form, so if you look at it, they just traded Steven Adams to get below the first apron, and if you get Nic Claxton, that's going to put you right back where you were.
They would have to make a sign and trade, right? It would have to almost certainly involve a Luke Kennard. It would almost certainly have to involve somebody else that makes a decent amount of money, like a Marcus Smart, which I don't know is necessarily on the table, a Brandon Clark. It would have to be something like that to make it make sense. I'm with you. I don't think there's a lot of smoke to the fire here. I think it was a wonderful article, and you haven't read it over the commercial appeal. You most certainly should. I get the logic behind the connection, and I understand why fans make that line point to point connection because of that relationship. And Claxton next to Jaren Jackson Jr. theoretically would be a pretty solid pairing. But again, making the money make sense of it would be the challenge. I am curious because you obviously got to see Nic Claxton there in the flesh on Monday. He was part of the reason Jaren had a rough game, which we'll talk more about here in the second segment. What do we need to kind of grade these guys on moving forward in terms of their performances night in, night out? How do you see that fit playing out? Because it's not like Claxton is a dominant rebounder in and of himself, right? He's a better rebounder than Jaren, but it's not like you're replacing Steven Adams with a similar rebounding force. How would you envision, hypothetically, because again, a lot would have to happen for this to occur. How could you see a Claxton type fitting alongside Jaren in that 4-5 pairing?
Well, there's one part of it where you talk about Jaren and where he's at his best. You go back to the last 2 seasons when he was near the top of the NBA in blocks. Each season, Steven Adams was a big part of that. Having Steven Adams on the back end, and Steven Adams was a different kind of rim protector than Claxton. Claxton is deterring shots with blocks. Steven Adams is deterring shots with his size and his physicality. So it's a little bit different. But at the end of the day, guys aren't making a lot of shots when those two dudes are at the rim. So when the Grizzlies have Steven Adams on the back end, you're okay with Jaren Jackson Jr. roaming around the perimeter a little bit more and kind of freestyling around and getting a lot of those blocks in when guys are going to the rim and he's chasing them from behind and things like that. Whereas now, when there's no Steven Adams or there's no Claxton type of player on the floor, when you get past Jaren Jackson Jr., you're just going straight at the defense. There's no other shot blocking threat on the Grizzlies. So now the Grizzlies are in a position where they have to keep him kind of in the paint a little bit more to protect the rim. So Claxton helps you from that standpoint of allowing Jaren to be the best version of himself defensively and allowing Nic Claxton, and to be the best version of himself defensively, because he's always been good at just erasing at the rim. I mean, he had 3 blocks against the Grizzlies, and a couple of them were just Jaren trying to go right at him and him just knocking the ball, away. So I think it makes sense from that standpoint. Claxton's got some, like some dribbling ability to him. We saw there was a time where I remember Lamar Stevens gambled near half court, and Claxton took it all the way to the rim, like past the entire Grizzlies defense. And again, that goes back to the point that Lamar Stevens was at center, so there was no rim protection left for the Grizzlies, and Claxton just finger rolled it all the way through. And it kind of surprised me, but that's kind of the type of game that he has. So it makes sense, but from the player standpoint, but when you get to the business side of it, it'll be tough to pull off. Like you said, the Grizzlies have to move probably a bigger contract. You mentioned pretty much the players that come to mind for myself as well. That's the only way that I could see it happening, the sign and trade standpoint of it. But at the end of the day, if he wants to come there, like if he says, hey, I want to go play with Ja Morant, it's something that, hey, you got to let it happen, and then you just work out the kinks of it after that. But it makes sense on the floor. I think it definitely will put the Grizzlies in that elite tier of the Western Conference if Nic Claxton came to Memphis.
You'd have to imagine we're talking Marcus Smart-ish money, right? $18 to $20 million a year
for
Nic Claxton.
Yeah.
And I think he's about 25 years old. So he fits the timeline, obviously, as a new core piece. It's possible, but it's not probable at this stage. And I still kind of stand by the logic of drafting a cost-controlled center, whether it's at the lottery pick, you trade back, whatever the case might be. But we can talk more about free agency and trades. There's going to be plenty of time for that down the road here on Locked On Grizzlies. When we come back, we're going to discuss the idea of grading on a curve. And if you're not familiar with that from your days in high school or college, I'll be happy as the resident teacher to kind of discuss my logic, watching some of the reactions both on our own YouTube channel as well as on X and other social media platforms to what happened on Monday night. We'll talk more about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by BetterHelp. It can be challenging to get something off of your chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that stuff out, especially to somebody who is unbiased on your life. So maybe you're really, really mad that Memphis laid an egg on Monday night and you wish they had competed better against the Nets. Or perhaps you're frustrated at the overall state of affairs for the Grizzlies in this gap year lost season, whatever you want to call it. Therapy can be different for everyone, and it's important to understand that most of us have bigger problems than the struggles of our favorite sports team, but still, it's nice to get things off of your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. This episode is also brought to you by Stitch Fix. I know Damichael's a big fan of Stitch Fix because Damichael is a big fan of looking good. You get instant confidence when you get an outfit that makes you look like a Damichael Cole. That's why I have decided to give a shot to Stitch Fix so I can be as suave as Damichael. You can easily upgrade your wardrobe. You get professional stylist assistants who sends you the just right pieces, and the fit is always on point. It's like they have some sort of predisposition with style. I'm not sure how they do it, but they get me, and I'm sure they get Damichael as well in terms of his fits. And if you don't love something, you can just send it back. Shipping, returns, and exchanges are always free. Style that makes you feel as good as you look. Get started today at stitchfix.com/lockedon. That's stitchfix.com/lockedon. stitchfix.com/lockedon. Look as good as Damichael Cole, why don't you? Speaking of Damichael Cole, Damichael, I know you know this, and perhaps our listeners aren't as familiar, our viewers, however you're checking us out, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I am a teacher by trade, right? I'm an educator. That's my day job. I enjoy hobbying, doing podcasting with you as my side hustle, but I am a educator by trade. And the main thing that I took away on Tuesday in the wake of the Nets-Grizzlies game, because I was pretty hard on the Grizzlies in our Tuesday episode, or at least I thought I was. And then I saw the reactions from other people, and I was kind compared to some of the anger that I saw towards Taylor Jenkins, towards Jaren Jackson Jr. And we've talked about this before, right? Like we've had this conversation about how can you possibly judge these people on a grand scale, game to game, whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
I think I saw somebody, Chris on X. I wish I had his Twitter account in front of me. I want to shout him out. He called them like Jaren and the Chipmunks or something like that, or Jaren and the Heartbeats. He was coming up with like Motown band names for
Jaren Jackson Jr. and the Miracles, huh?
Right. And that's a great way to phrase it. Like none of these
Yeah.
guys are in their ideal role at this stage. So good NBA teams have stinkers, right? The last 2 years before Memphis had this downturn, we've seen a good Grizzlies team have an inexplicable loss. So still seeing some of the reaction in terms of negativity that I saw, it led me as a teacher to think about grading on a curve. When a student struggles on an assessment, when a student doesn't do an assignment, you can perhaps, if it's a larger problem than just one or two students, grade on a curve and you add some points to the grade. Because if you give a test and everybody in the room fails the test, maybe the test is the problem, not the students, or maybe the teacher is the problem that delivered the lessons, not the students. So I have that vibe about that game now, even though I was one of the ones that was hard on them, but in retrospect, seeing some of the other reactions, I was pretty kind. I think that you have to grade these guys on a curve, right? GG Jackson had a really rough outing, but for all of the context that we've discussed over and over again here on Locked On Grizzlies, you grade him on a curve, being the youngest player in the NBA in a healthy situation. He's probably playing in South Haven still, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
You have Vince Williams Jr. He's played more basketball at this point than he probably ever has in his life in terms of minutes on the court. He's probably getting tired and worn down. Jaren Jackson Jr. is not the kind of player to be a first option each and every game. It's just not reality. We can go up and down the list. How do you feel about my perspective for the remainder of the season? If the team was healthy and Jaren had the showing that he had on Monday, I would be just as mad as the folks in the spaces. Yeah. But the reality is that's not their circumstance. And because of that, that context allows for me to look at Jaren and say, yeah, I'd like for him to do better, but I got to grade him on a curve because of all that he's been asked to do all season long for this team.
Yeah, look at you showing some grace, Joe. How about that?
Yeah, look at me. That's my middle name, Joe Grace Mullinax.
Joe Grace Mullinax. You heard it here first. He just got his middle name changed to Grace. So I like the idea of what you're saying. I do think, that's a good way of looking at it, like grading these guys with the curve. But at the same time, I think we're at a point where Vince Williams, GG Jackson, and Jaren Jackson Jr. are all getting extensive expanded opportunity. And I'm expecting good things out of them, especially, Vince Williams has been so consistent. He's probably the one guy that's like, oh, he had an off night. You're not really worried. Jaren Jackson Jr., I think it was more matchup than anything. Nic Claxton just, was like swallowing everything that he put up pretty much.
One of the few guys all season, in the league that has been able to slow down Jaren this year.
Yeah, and I was talking to him about it, like after the game. I was asking Jaren because his recent matchup has been more of those bigger, bulkier centers that, he can use his quickness to get by, or if he doesn't really get by him, they just don't jump, like Claxton can, or they don't have the length that Claxton does. And that's what we saw. Like, he would get to his spots, I think, decently well, but as Jaren put it, he was off balance, which I've heard Brevin Knight in the past. It's something that Brevin really kind of put me on to when he was talking about how sometimes when Jaren's off balance and whatnot, when he's going to the rim, he's not getting elevation, which makes it easier for not even someone just the size of Claxton, but you could throw a guy like Kawhi Leonard on him, and it makes it easy for him to block it because he's not playing 6'11" when he's doing that. When he's off balance and things, he's playing like 6'7". So that's why Claxton had little to no trouble with blocking those shots. But after the game, I also was talking to Jaren about this role that he's in and kind of looking at the big picture of it, Joe. Like, look, man, this 1 year ago, Ja was playing, Brandon Clark was playing. You just traded for Luke Kennard and all these things. Like, you were still hopeful that Steven Adams was coming back, and you were a top 2 seed in the Western Conference. And then now you're near the bottom of the West, and Jaren's shooting, for the most part, 16, 17 shots a game. And he was trying to look at it from the standpoint of, hey, I gotta I got to be positive about this. Hey, a lot of players don't get the chance to be the featured guy, for a season like this and whatnot. And he's trying to embrace it from that perspective, which I think will be good in the long run. We've seen that even over the past couple seasons. We've seen him be a really good isolation scorer. Now this is his chance to continue to grasp that opportunity, because when Ja gets back, that's going to be the separation. That's what's going to make this team a better half-court offense. Same thing with guys like GG Jackson. I want GG Jackson to continue to get these opportunities. We talked about it with Taylor Jenkins. Going to continue to put him in playmaking roles. 1 of 13. Look, grace, show him a little grace. Yeah, you grade him on the curve. Yeah, but 1 of 13 ain't acceptable. Not for GG Jackson. Not at this point. I know, yes, he just turned 19, but the dude is super talented. And he had some good looks. So I'll chalk it up to that for the most part. There were a couple shots in there. Like there was one time, Joe, he just went barreling down to the rim in front of 3 dudes. And I looked straight over at Taylor Jenkins because I knew it was coming. And next thing you know what Taylor Jenkins did? He pointed over there to Yuta Watanabe, told him to get up. And as soon as that next whistle came, Yuta Watanabe pointed at GG Jackson. He said, I'm coming in for you. And GG Jackson went to the bench, and Taylor Jenkins had a long talk to him. So those moments are still happening with him. And I think that's important to point out. But yeah, I like the idea of grading these guys on the curve, but you can't let up on them because you don't want them to pick up any bad habits or anything like that. Like, this is a crucial developmental time for all 3 of the aforementioned guys.
Agreed completely. It's more so about in any individual game not losing your mind, right? Which I feel like, and again, I know a lot of our listeners and viewers
Yeah,
don't
that's
necessarily
important. Yeah.
hang out on X like others do, including myself. But I do think that the grace really comes from the reality. If GG Jackson shoots that poorly over a 5 or 10 game stretch, let's have a deeper conversation.
There we go. There we go.
Same thing with Jaren. If he gets locked down for the next 2 weeks, let's get a little bit more worried. Maybe not jumping off the bandwagon so quickly with the good things that we've seen those guys and Vince Williams Jr. do so far this season. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we will close out this episode talking about Grizzlies-Wolves tonight. Big game for the Grizzlies. Can't wait to check it out. They're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, friendly reminder that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. It's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. 24/7 coverage of the top sports stories of the day with local experts like Damichael and myself on Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is also brought to you by the good folks over at eBay Motors. I am a big fan of eBay Motors, and I know that Damichael is as well, because when you're talking precision, when you're talking passion, when you're talking about drive, that's what brings home winning trophies, and it's also what keeps your car alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers to LED headlights and everything in between. Speed, power, style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one whip, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home a big win. Can keep your ride or die car alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only guaranteed to United States customers. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, closing out the show, talking about Grizzlies-Wolves. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Michael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Damichael, of course, of the Commercial Appeal. He's a Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication there in Memphis. I've been covering the Grizzlies for over a decade now. Between the two of us, here, there, and everywhere, you are in the right place with Locked On Grizzlies. And we've had a good show, speculating. Everybody likes some good speculation. Nic Claxton to Memphis. Could that make sense? We also talked about grading these players on a curve this season, given all the trials and tribulations that they faced. And those trials and tribulations carry forward tonight against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Memphis is familiar with a couple of the Wolves, right? Mike Conley just signed a contract extension with Minnesota. Good to see Mike. Again, it's still weird to not see him in a Grizzlies uniform, but nice to see that he's getting the chance to close out his career on a pretty darn good basketball team, right outside of the Celtics and maybe
And
the
he just got
Clippers.
extended. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That extension is very helpful. So I think that's good to see. You got Kyle Anderson on that team. The Minnesota Timberwolves look primed for a run, and that may result in them running straight through the Grizzlies in this game.
Yeah, the Timberwolves are what 3-0, I think, this season against the
Really good.
Grizzlies.
Really good.
I mean, Conley's had a couple games where he just hasn't missed, from 3-point range against the Grizzlies. He's been knocking them down really, really well this season. That offense, the way they play together, I was talking to the Star Tribune beat writer out there, Chris Hine in Minnesota. He was asking me, like, what do I think about, that group? And it's like they fit together so perfectly to me. Like you got, Anthony Edwards and his ability to create with the ball in his hands for his teammates, but Mike Conley being a guy who, we saw it in Memphis for years when Mark Gasol would be in playmaking roles, and Mike Conley being just a very efficient spot up shooter as a point guard. That is just, that is a great trait to have, and it fits perfectly in Minnesota because with D'Angelo Russell, I think he was there. He wanted the ball more in his hands, and there was the kind of that situation just didn't feel as much as a cohesive fit as someone like Mike Conley, who is just not really a high volume, guy on the offensive end and still a very solid defender at this level. And we know about that front court. And that's going to be the game for me. Trey Jemison, talk about him for a quick second here, because I think this is one of the games he has to play. And the reason I say that is because everyone should know the situation at this point with the two-way guys and whatnot. They're prorated two-way deals. In the case of Trey Jemison, I think going into the last game, he had 15 to play. He had 25 games to play 15. So I think he has 24 games to play 15 right now, if I'm not mistaken. But it's right around that range. And with that being said, the Grizzlies are kind of looking at it from the perspective of he's going to be available for the games where they really need bigs. And it made sense in that last game, right? Like you're playing the Nets outside of Nic Claxton. The Nets don't really have, they run sharp is okay, but they don't have the type of bigs that the Timberwolves have. So with that being said, I think this is a game Trey Jemison should be active. And you start Jaren at center. You got Santi in there. You got Trey Jemison. But the point is, if Lamar Stevens is your backup center in this game, it's been working fine, against certain teams. But put him against Naz Reid, put him against Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. I just don't see that being a sight for everyone to see. But yeah, we know at this point that the Grizzlies are going to be pretty much outclassed on paper against most teams that they go against. You just got to look a little bit deeper into what to watch for at this point. And, Jaren going against this type of front court is going to be good for him because there is a realistic chance that he could be the starting center going forward, whether a lot of you like it or not. It's a realistic possibility. So this is good run for him. Again, it's a good chance for Gigi Jackson to bounce back. Vince Williams gets the guard Anthony Edwards. If you saw the last Timberwolves Grizzlies game, Vince Williams, I think he held Anthony Edwards to like one field goal in the first half. And then in the second half, Anthony Edwards just toasted the Grizzlies. So I'm looking forward to seeing that matchup as well.
How do you feel about the current state of play when it comes to Memphis? You mentioned their size issues. Lamar Stevens has been somebody that's been getting a lot of run, conversations on social media, comments in our YouTube sections and other podcasts.
I like him, yeah.
Comments. Again, Grizzlies fans have a habit, as do most sports fans, in fairness, of falling in love with a brand new guy that's really just someone that is lucky to be an end of bench player.
He's in the honeymoon stage right now.
It's the honeymoon stage. I don't want to hate on him because I do think he has a value, and I mentioned it on yesterday's show. He almost has like a evil Dylan Brooks kind of feel to him in terms of what he physically is capable of. And again, you mentioned him as the backup center. I think he is more able to do that than Dylan would be in a
you want to hear my hot take?
Sure.
I don't know if it's a hot take, but I got something for you. What if I told you right now, based on what we've seen from him, and I talked to some people out in Cleveland too, like they liked him out there and what he brought as well. But right now, what I'm seeing from Lamar Stevens, this is the type of player that the Grizzlies wanted David Roddy to be.
Ooh.
That's what I'm seeing. The physicality, the ability to, we've seen him guard Giannis, guard Alperen
Yeah,
Sengun,
that's true.
guard Zion Williamson. This is what David Roddy was supposed to be, as well as being efficient enough and knowing your strengths and weaknesses on the offensive end. Lamar Stevens so far has been what the Grizzlies and what fans probably expected and wanted from David Roddy.
Well, and in fairness to David Roddy, Lamar Stevens has been here for a cup of coffee.
Yeah,
right? It's not like
yeah,
Stevens has had the same sample size. And
it's
if
early.
It was
That's why it's a hot take.
If it was the Dallas Mavericks, David Roddy, turns into the Wolverine against the Dallas Mavericks. It's Logan at the end of the movie that bears his name in terms of destroying people left and right whenever Roddy sees Dallas. The Suns better hope for a Phoenix-Dallas playoff series and just let Roddy cook. I think that's fair. And again, I said on the show, I am cool with the idea of Stevens being an out-of-rotation member of the roster. I'm not saying you write him off or waive him or anything like that. But I do think to be at the stage of his career that he's at, to be traded as often as he has been, clearly there's something that isn't there in terms of what the other teams did. They didn't value him enough to keep him. Right. So I think that there has to be some sense of reality to that. I don't think Memphis is smarter than both Cleveland and Boston. It's just one of those things where maybe it's a better fit in terms of scheme, but Stevens obviously fitting in Memphis as a reserve player perhaps would be the best news for Memphis, because they're going to need guys like that, right, that are cost controlled, that can provide opportunity for contributions when their name is called. Thank you so much for checking us out on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Damichael and I appreciate it very much. On our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies, Damichael, you'll be flying solo after a late night Grizzlies game. I'll do a solo one. Damichael will do a solo one. I'm old. I can't stay up that late all the time. Damichael's young and ready to go. I'm sure you'll have lots of hot takes about Grizzlies-Wolves tomorrow.
Yeah, it's. I tell you what. Hopefully, it's not as bad as the one that you had to talk about. I was interested, Joe. I tuned in. And I was like, what is Joe possibly gonna say after this game? But maybe we'll see. I'm looking to see who's gonna bounce back. Everyone pretty much except like Lamar Stevens played bad. So
agreed.
Santi, G.G. Jackson, Vince Williams, Jaren Jackson Jr. A lot of bounce back opportunities in this next game.
Make sure you're checking that episode and every episode of Locked On Grizzlies out wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Make sure you're checking us out on Locked On Sports Today, 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, plus now available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Channels app. So much fun stuff to close out the week with, talking about the Memphis Grizzlies. We hope that you'll join Damichael for his solo show on Thursday, and then, of course, we'll be back together for Friday's episode. For Damichael, I am Joe. Stay locked in, Memphis Grizzlies fans. Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy Grizzlies Wolves, and we'll catch you next time on Locked On.